Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm happy you can see me. Now you'll notice that's a change to my typical intro, guys, gals, non-binary pals, because somebody proposed to me that that intro doesn't flow well in my podcast, and this is somebody I know does not come at it from a place of hatred of the trans community. Just somebody who just said it doesn't just match the flow of your podcast. I don't know. I'm undecided. So if anyone has an opinion on that, please feel free to voice it. So for now, I'm going to try out the new intro. It's going to be welcome everybody. So good to get that out of the way. Also, I may be slurring a little bit. That's because I had to have some work done on my fake teeth today, and I am getting used to some of the changes. Also, there will be a guest this evening. This guest will be Mr. Bowl of Ice Cream, because for the next few days I can only have stuff like ice cream. I'm taking advantage of it. So, Mr. Bowl of Ice Cream is a guest. Now, I've been learning a lot recently, and I'm really excited to share this with you. So I started this off with I was going to talk about stolen elections, and research brought me in other directions. So my original plan was solely to talk about the 1824 election. Instead, I'm going to give you three. We're going to do 1820, 1824, and 1828. And I feel like I can combine them all into one video because I'm not going to go as number-centric as I usually do. There'll be some numbers, sorry, but I'm going to be avoiding them, like the intricate details, because in order to really explain the numerology behind the votes in 1824, at least, I would have to show you graphics and such, and I haven't purchased the software yet to do that. So I reserve the right to do another video on the election of 1824 at a later date. But here we're going to just try to do a 3-in-1. And I think these three are appropriate because it just shows how the country can change so radically in the political sphere over the course of, 8 years. So, 1820, you had the incumbent president, James Monroe, running against a very formidable opponent named, that's embarrassing, named 1820, James Monroe versus, I feel unprepared, so why did I post this? Oh, he ran against nobody. He ran against nobody? I thought only George Washington was the one who ran unopposed. They taught you wrong. And actually, argument can be made that George Washington didn't run unopposed. But that's a story for another date, and I'm sure I'll be going down that rabbit hole eventually, but James Monroe had no formidable opponent. Wait, he had no opponent. James Monroe belonged to what was called the Democratic Republican Party. Yeah, the two names we currently have, and they were smushed into one. And the Federalist Party was the other party. But they had died out. There really were no Federalists anymore. And we were in what was known as the era of good feelings. I'm not a fan of that name because slavery existed. And I don't think you should call any part of history that had slavery good feelings. But this is what history has deemed it as. So, You had Monroe versus nobody. The country, however, was slowly creeping its way to civil war, which would eventually break out in 1860, and you could see the Band-Aid approaches. In his first term, James Monroe had enacted the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically said for every slave state admitted to the Union, there would have to be a free state admitted, and vice versa. So there would always be an even amount of slave states and free states. Once again, that was a Band-Aid solution to the original sin of slavery. Also, there was the economic panic of 1819, which could be compared to the Great Depression, but they didn't use the word depression because it wasn't coined until Herbert Hoover came around in the 1920s. And I bet you he regrets coining that term. But Monroe got us out of it. Chances are he got us into it, but he took the credit for getting us out of it. Basically, no one ran against him. Funny enough, though, 4 people ran under the pretty much dead Federalist bandwagon for vice president without a presidential nominee. It didn't matter. Monroe won in a landslide against nobody, and his vice president, who I do have to look this up really quickly, his vice president, Daniel D. Tompkins, won the vice presidency also quite handedly. However, there were 14 votes in the Electoral College that were allotted to these Federalist candidates for vice president, not president, who, just for the sake of completion, were named Richard Stockton, Daniel Rodney, Robert Gula Harper, and Richard Rush, who really are quite irrelevant to this story. Daniel D. Tompkins won the vice presidency quite easily. So, however, Monroe did not get he did not get electoral college unanimity. It's for 2 reasons. First, there was a faithless elector. Well, what's a faithless elector? Is it an elector who's cheating on his spouse, his or her spouse, but back then it would have been his? No, that's not what a faithless elector is. Faithless elector is somebody who has been assigned to vote for a specific candidate, but votes for somebody else. So William Plummer cast a vote for John Quincy Adams. This could have been for one of 2 reasons. The popularly believed reason is that he only wanted Washington to hold the distinction of having an electoral college unanimous vote. I do not think this is the correct rationale, mainly because George Washington did not have a unanimous electoral college vote, because the inner guts of the electoral college were changed between Washington and the 1820 re-election of Monroe. The original electoral college required the electors to cast 2 votes. Now, there was nowhere in there where they would say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, none of that, just 2. So Washington only got half, which was 100% of what he could have possibly gotten, but he only got half, technically. So, I'm sure we'll go down the Electoral College change and rabbit hole. And also back then, the individual who got the most amount of electoral votes would become the president, and the person who came in second place would become the vice president. That had to change, and that changed between the 1796 and 1800 election due to the Jefferson-Burr administration, which you really just had two guys who absolutely hated each other. And Jefferson was president and Burr was vice president, so they had to change the Constitution. And the first ticket was actually in 1800. I digress. Can you imagine, though, a Biden-Trump White House, though? It's just silly to think about. But, okay, I digress. So, we have this election of 1820. William Plummer is the one faithless elector. And supposedly, when John Quincy Adams found out about it, he was mortified. He was disgusted. He was not honored at all. He thought it would be a hindrance and downgrade the value of the Monroe administration. There were two other votes that didn't go to Monroe, and they were both from Mississippi, and they were both because the electors died between the date of the not election, because there was no opponent, and the counting of the electoral votes. At that point, there had been 6 straight victories where the winner was from Virginia. And that would come in the form of Jefferson twice, Madison twice, and Monroe twice. The amount of votes cast, I told you I had to do little numbers here, was 108,359. And that really doesn't matter, but you'll see why when I describe the other elections. Also, this was the last election until 1916. This is just a fun little fact here, where you had an incumbent ticket, same president, same vice presidential nominee here, that being Monroe Tompkins, would win re-election until 1916, where Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Marshall would win re-election. But after this, you had presidents switching vice presidents, and you never had the same exact ticket. Repeat victory. So, we have a one-party system now. The Democratic Republicans, the Federalists, they're dead. They're dead. I think they got like a few members in Congress, and then they were gone. Then comes the election of 1824, where Monroe could have easily decided to run again and probably would have won another uncontested election. However, he decided, because he was very popular at the time, he decided to honor the tradition set by George Washington to not seek more than 2 terms. Cool. We're going to have a little water here as we transition to 1824. Now, this is the one where I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, but it is a cluster F. Just how 1820 was really simple, 1824 was nowhere near simple. So we still just had this one party. But you know how when you have a big team and you're competing for something, you have discrepancies that can get very nasty within your team, and infighting and disagreements. So although you're all technically on the same team, you're fractionalizing. Well, that's what happened in 1824. The first individual to announce and quickly leave the election was John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of War under Monroe. And he had agreed with all the candidates that he would be the only one to run for vice president. Although there would be other votes cast, it was decided John C. Calhoun, regardless, he'd be the vice president. So, the congressional legislature met to decide who the candidate for the Democratic Republican Party would be, who then would become the president because there was no opponent. And that's exactly what happened, and we had a president, William Crawford, end of story. I joke. The Congressional Caucus did meet, and they did choose William Crawford, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. However, only 66 out of 218 members of that caucus decided to even show up and cast votes. So you had an in for the other Democratic Republicans to say it wasn't legitimate because it didn't meet quorum. And now, of course, they wouldn't take advantage of that because they'd be going against their team. Again, I kid. The other candidates were Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And this guy wanted to be president probably more than anyone in history who didn't end up becoming president. Like, just if you read any of Clay's literature that's not calling Jackson's wife a H-O-R-E, it's all about how he's the best choice to be president over everybody and anybody. So he puts his hat in the ring. Then we have John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was the son of the second president, John Adams. He was very well learned. Supposedly he knew 7 languages. He was going on diplomatic missions with his father when he was like 10 years old. Like, if there was somebody who had the most amount of just worldly experience here, by far John Quincy Adams. And he was also part of a dynasty. But he was also a Northerner, and remember, we had this long stretch of Virginians being elected, and John Quincy Adams was from Braintree, Massachusetts, which my wonderful family now resides, and I love them all if they are watching this. So then you have Andrew Jackson, who history has not been very nice to, and I believe justifiably not very nice to, but at the time was very popular because he was the war hero of the War of 1812. This is also sort of the first election where the founding fathers, if you would, aren't playing much of a role because they're either really old or have died out. So this is the first election of a new generation, if you would. Although everyone did try to court the Jefferson vote, but he actually never formally endorsed anyone, or at least the paperwork doesn't exist anymore to say if he did, who he chose. Unfortunately, that would be really interesting to know. So, you also need to keep in mind that how electors were selected is not like today, where you have a popular vote within a state and then whoever wins gets the electors. That applied to some states, which if I do a more descriptive video, I'll just lay it all out. But other states, it was just the legislature who chose. And there were other states where the party chose. So there was really no consistency. Well, America went to the polls, but kind of not really. And the amount of popular votes cast was 365,833. And that's the only number I'm going to give with this one, because I could go down the number rabbit hole. But the winner of the most amount of electoral votes and the winner of the popular vote was Andrew Jackson, who then, of course, became president. Again, I kid about the second part. He really did have the most amount of electoral votes and popular votes, but he had a plurality, not a majority. What's the difference, Ian? I'm happy you asked. A plurality is when you have more than anybody else, but don't cross the 50% threshold. Make sense? So because you had 4 people running in Crawford, Adams, Clay, and Jackson, Jackson was able to get a plurality but not cross the 50% threshold. However, the 12th Amendment required that in order to be elected president, you needed a majority of the electors, not just a plurality. So, what happens then if nobody gets a majority? Well, then we have this interesting system where the president is chosen by the House of Representatives, sorta, kinda. I'll get to that. And the Senate chooses the vice president. Now, there was no issue with the vice president. It was already agreed. It was going to be John C. Calhoun, bada bing, bada boom. But the presidency, you had Jackson, who I believe rightfully won, or believed he won, because he did have the majority, the plurality, in both. But then you had John Quincy Adams, who sort of saw being president as his birthright. Now, when I say it's thrown to the House, I need to make 2 things very clear. Firstly, only the top 3 vote getters in the Electoral College get their name brought to the House. Not if you get 1 electoral vote, your name is up for grabs in the House. Has to be the top 3. And there goes William Crawford. Bye, William Crawford. I mean, he was the choice of the party. He was the one who was supposed to become president. But it didn't quite happen that way, so Crawford's out. Okay? So now we have Clay, Quincy Adams, and Jackson. Whatever are we going to do? Now, I said really not really before, chosen by the House, because they have this really weird system which only applies to a presidential election where nobody gets a majority. Each state in the House gets 1 vote. Just 1. Which means, if this were to happen today, you would have a state like Missouri, which has, I believe, 1 House member, roughly, not 1. And you'd have California, which has 55 House members, and they both would be equal with 1 vote. So, the 3 top vote getters, again, Clay, Adams, and Jackson, go to the House, And something very interesting happens. Clay, I spoke incorrectly. I have to correct myself. Crawford was in that top tier, not Clay. Clay was there, though, because he was Speaker of the House. I apologize. Again, dental work. Just assume for the last minute every time I said Clay, I meant Crawford. So, you have Adams, Jackson, and Crawford coming to the House, hoping to get that majority, and Clay getting the boot. But, remember, Clay wanted to be president more than anything. So Clay, being Speaker of the House, did a little shenanigans. Because now it's commonly believed that the stepping stool to becoming president is the office of the vice president. Back then, it was the office of Secretary of State. And this led to what was called the corrupt bargain. There was a corrupt bargain where Clay would rally every state he could, and he had a persuasion as Speaker of the House to vote for Adams, not Jackson. In turn, Adams would make Clay Secretary of State, making him the heir apparent to the presidency. So, some votes took place. No one got the majority until somebody did. But we'll talk about a character that is very historically forgotten, but I think deserves to be talked about. And that is Stephen Van Rensselaer, who was in the House and had a vote. And by all paperwork of the time, people believe he was intending on voting for Jackson, which at that point would have given Jackson the majority. And supposedly when he was walking into the chamber, Clay physically roughed him up and demanded he vote for Adams. Van Rensselaer was a very religious man, so after being roughed up, he went to his seat to remain in silent prayer until it was time to cast the vote, in which time he believed the answer would come to him. Well, when it was time to vote and he opened his eyes, there was only an Adams ballot in front of him. And he saw that as a sign from his God to vote for Adams. And John Quincy Adams won the election. And by win, I mean became president. Because he really didn't win anything except that last election, which they had to rough up Van Rensselaer. Bet you didn't expect a Stephen Van Rensselaer appearance in this edition. See, I'm surprises everywhere. Jackson was pissed. Pissed? Pissed. Now, he never used words like rigged or stolen, as those are words people are using inaccurately presently. Not to voice my opinion on current events, but he said he made it his goal that the day the House chose Adams, that in 1828 he was coming back with a vengeance. And he announced his candidacy and was endorsed by his local Tennessee newspaper while Monroe was still president, even before Quincy Adams was sworn in. So, now we have the Adams-Calhoun administration. So during the next 4 years, some interesting stuff happens. Now, although Adams was aligning himself with the Democratic Republican Party, because that was the only one that existed, he really held on to Federalist values. And keep in mind, the only actual Federalist identifying Northern president before him was his father, John Adams. So he had to play the game and call himself a Democratic Republican, but that wasn't in line with his belief structure. Jackson couldn't have cared less what party he called himself, but he wanted his own political party. He wasn't going to do this, we're all part of the same group, but we have an internal discussion and the winner becomes, no, that wasn't going to happen again. So he created what was known as at the time as the Jacksonian Democrats. So we had the Jacksonian Democrats and the Democratic Republicans. And we're back to the two-party system. Now, one interesting thing he did during the next 4 years, through his friend, who was Senator Martin Van Buren, yeah, you'll hear that name in a later video and more in depth, was to expand voting rights and to convince states to have their electors chosen by popular vote, which, keep in mind, happened in some states in 1824, but wasn't really a big thing. Also, he went on a mission to convince states to lower their voting requirements. Now, I'm not talking about anything silly like letting women vote or anything, normal like that. But instead of it just being white male landowning people who could vote, they took the landowning out of it. White men could vote. And you also had the 3/5 compromise, which, if you don't know what that is, I'll discuss that in another video, because it's a stain upon our country where a black person was deemed to have 3/5, to be 3/5 of a white person. So he went from state to state to try to convince them to change how they choose their electors, just waiting for 1820. And it got dirty, and it got dirty fast. But it really wasn't dirty through the people you think. Jackson, dirty, was mudslinging at Adams from day one. Adams saw himself above that. He saw, and he remembered the election his father had against Jefferson and didn't want to repeat that. Henry Clay, on the other hand, did not have those values and morals. So behind the scenes, and there's a strong argument to be made that Adams was not aware of this, started throwing mud back at Jackson. And the reason I say there's an argument to be made that Adams was unaware is because it is documented that Adams was approached with these negative campaigning ideas in which he flat out rebuked and denied and said, I want no part of that. That's not how this country works. Did he end up changing his mind and get involved in the muds? Maybe, I don't know. But you really had Henry Clay on behalf of Adams against Jackson in the dirty campaigning sphere. What kind of mudslinging was there done? Well, first, they went after Jackson's wife, who was named Rachel, who hated politics. She hated being in D.C. I don't think she wanted her husband to be president, but so they called her a bigamist, which in the most technical sense was accurate, but not really fair in the spirit of her situation. She had married at the age of 18 to a very abusive person. Obviously, being a woman at the time, she had no formal education. Eventually, they decided to get divorced, but he never filed the paperwork. She believed he did. There's no evidence that she didn't. And then Jackson went to work at her family's house. They met, fell in love, and got married, although the divorce paperwork wasn't filed. So, technically, was she a bigamist? Yes. But not really in the spirit of who she was. She was actually a very private woman who wanted no part of politics. But loved her husband very much. And many negative things to be said about Andrew Jackson in a historical context, his devotion to his wife not being one of them. Also, the Adams people, through Clay, accused Jackson of murdering 6 U.S. soldiers. Technically true, but you have to look at what actually happened. There were 6 soldiers during the War of 1812 who were accused of treason. And Jackson, being the general at the time, had to sign off on their executions. There's no evidence that Jackson knew these gentlemen or knew whether or not they were traitors, but he just signed off on them. Now keep in mind, Jackson was a very violent man, and there's a huge, the argument could easily be made that he slit their throats personally. I just didn't find any evidence of that. So you had Clay throwing that clay or mud? I never thought of that until now, at Jackson. So then, but Jackson was going to come back with a vengeance, but he was going to throw his mud at Adams, not at Clay. So what kind of stuff, did Adams do that was that bad? That, Jackson would throw mud at? Well, he did have issues in his presidency, but the mud that was thrown at him, there's no proof had any accuracy to it. First thing he said was that Adams went on a spending spree with government money for furniture and gaming equipment. Gaming equipment? What gaming equipment did they have in the 1800s for the White House? So there was that. They also claimed that Adams would bring Russian Tsar Alexander, WHORES, for his pleasure and enjoyment. Again, there is no evidence that, at least I was able to find, that had any truth or veracity to it. It was just something he threw at him. So then we'll just call it the Clay Adams people, threw back at Jackson by calling his mother a mulatto, H-O-R-E. Now, a mulatto individual at that time was defined as somebody who was half white and half black. Now, today we celebrate diversity, of course. Back then, it was, if that were to be true, which it was not, it would be a public shame on the individual. And, I'm actually very happy the country has gone beyond even seeing that as a negative. The whole time, it was honestly believed that Adams was sheltered from knowing what was going on. So you really had a 4-year campaign. And then the election of 1828 happened. And you had 2 parties. So you had 2 candidates. Now I want to talk about John C. Calhoun for a second, who was Adams' vice president. He is the only person in American history to run for re-election as vice president on the other ticket. What do you mean by that? Just as I said, he was Adams' vice president, but he ran under the Jackson ticket. Jackson Calhoun, 1828. And John Quincy Adams would end up choosing a gentleman named Robert Rush as his vice presidential nominee, candidate, what have you. Adams made some mistakes during his presidency, though, mainly having to do with tariffs, which would be very difficult to explain long form. Let's just say the price of cotton shot up tenfold, and the South wasn't hearing anything Adams had to say. And Jackson had somewhat of an appeal to the North as well, although the North was supposed to be Adams' country. This time, only 2 states had their electors not chosen through popular vote. And that would have been Delaware and South Carolina. Voting became something more important. And at this point, the amount of votes cast was 1,153,779. Keep in mind, the previous election only had roughly 365,000. So it pretty much multiplied by 3.5 times the amount of people who came out and voted. And Jackson cleaned the floor with Quincy Adams, popular vote-wise and electoral college-wise. Nothing had to be thrown to the House. It was a landslide. There was nothing to be questioned. And Adams was hurt, of course. And Jackson felt it. He got his revenge. Now, I don't want to turn this into a history of how Andrew Jackson is one of the most awful people in America, but he was one of the most awful people in American history. Now, Adams did not go to the Jackson inauguration. Following in the footsteps of his father, who in 1796 did not go to the Thomas Jefferson inauguration. And the reason he gave was that there was so much bad blood between the factions. He didn't say himself and Jackson. He said the factions, that America needed to heal, and his presence there would only slow that process down. I don't buy it. Kind of sounds like a BS reason to me. Probably just sour grapes. Sour grapes. So, while the inauguration was happening, he was packing up and ready to go. And on Inauguration Day, Jackson showed up while Quincy Adams was still packing and threw what was considered, and still considered, a drunken frat party from hell. Thousands of dollars worth of damage. Sia swinging from the chandeliers. Okay, well, not Sia. She wasn't born yet. But you get the point. And that party would last for about 8 years because things would go crazy. I want to rewind. I don't think I used the term corrupt bargain earlier. I might have, but So the whole Clay Adams, Van Rensselaer roughing up is historically called the corrupt bargain. I don't know if I said that. Just wanted to be complete. Now, so I just think it's interesting and fascinating. I hate the word interesting. Fascinating to show how when in 1820 you went from literally a non-contested election, so it was only one party, obviously, to a one-party, four-person, very contested election, to two parties, mudslinging, very heated election. Just how there's an era of good feelings, long over, and Jackson did not do anything to quell the boiling point that would eventually be reached having to do with slavery in America. One interesting fact, is that there is one other president, along with Mr. Quincy Adams, who has the distinction of being president for one term, but losing the popular vote twice. Anyone have any idea who the other one is? That would be Donald J. Trump. And I gotta be honest, that's technically a lie because Benjamin Harrison has that same distinction in 1888 and 1892. But I just like to, any way that I can distinguish Trump as a loser, I do. So we'll just say it's them too. We'll just ignore Benjamin Harrison for now. That's the story. This one probably felt a lot more jumbled than most of my videos. Again, the dental work, I'm tired. Sorry. But I even forgot to remind people at the beginning, if you're feeling any which way, well, I can't really say turn off the video because it's going to be over in like 30 seconds, but please get mental health help. Dial 988, which is the mental health suicide prevention hotline. And you will reach a professional who can help you with the issues you're dealing with. Please do not consider a permanent solution to a temporary problem. We need you. People love you. I love you. So that's what we got. We got, starting with Monroe versus nobody in 1820, to the Jackson versus Quincy Adams in 1828, with the Cluster F smushed election of 1824. And I do plan on doing 1824 long term, but I need to purchase the equipment to show pictures, so on and so forth, so you can understand the numbers and how different states determine their electors, so on and so forth. I said so on and so forth twice. I just wanted to give you a flavor and use this as a historical example over the course of 8 years. That's what I got. I'm going to bed. Good night.